Okay, thank you very much for joining me on the stage, the panel. My name's Callum Murray. I'm Editorial Director of Sportcal. I'll just quickly introduce the panelists and then we'll take it from there. Next to me is Loic Alves. He's legal counsel to the European Handball Federation, and he recently completed a master in European sport governance. Next to him is Silke Kassner. She's a canoe-kayak athlete, still canoeing and kayaking, but and hoping to qualify for the World Championships next year, you were saying. But she's also chair of the Athletes Commission of the DOSB, which is the German National Olympic Committee. And their position is, it's time that athletes take their destiny in their own hands. Next to her, we've already met Patrick. Patrick's involved in almost everything. He is the Renaissance man of sport. And if you want to know more about him than we already know, there's a profile of him in the latest issue of Sportcal magazine, which you can find outside. I'll leave Stanislas till last and just introduce quickly Jean-Loup Chappelet, who is one of our hosts here and who is a professor at the University of Lausanne and at IDHEAP. Some of you will know him already. Yes, I wanted to leave Stanislas to last because he is the Executive Secretary of the Council of Europe Enlarged Partial Agreement on Sport, and I don't know what that is. So perhaps I can ask him to explain.
Okay, thank you. Well, indeed, the presentation addressed public governance, political governance, and indeed the governments have a role in the promotion of sport at national level, in supporting the sports movement. Also, they are trying to coordinate their efforts at international level to see what are issues of common interest for the ministries of sport, which are issues on which governments should play a role, and there are a number of international conventions on anti-doping, on spectator violence, on match fixing. There are conferences of sports ministers addressing topical issues. Nowadays, good governance of sport is at the top of the agenda, I would say, but also issues such as sports and human rights. And within the Council of Europe, Enlarged Partial Agreement on Sport, we are the body in charge of this intergovernmental cooperation in the field of sport. I have to mention that Council of Europe, it's not the same as the European Union. It's a continental organization covering 47 countries from Iceland to Azerbaijan, which is matching more or less the geographical scope of the organization of sport in Europe, because the European federations are also covering the entire continent and not only the European Union. And it's an intergovernmental organization with no supranational competencies, mostly focused on values, democracy, human rights, rule of law. So that's it to introduce the Council of Europe. Don't care about Enlarged Partial Agreement of Sport. It's the body in charge of sport within the Council of Europe.
Okay, Stanislas, and just quickly, there are some sports organizations who I think it would be fair to say are suspicious of the role of the Council of Europe and other European bodies in the governance of sport. They think that it's their role to govern sport, not yours. What would you say to them?
Okay. No, I think indeed there is this old question of autonomy of sport and the fact that some sports organization would claim that it's not an issue for the public authorities. But I would say that we have moved a long way from the beginning of the year 2000, and we are more and more able to address issues of common interest together. For instance, that's the case of in anti-doping, where WADA is a joint venture bringing together public authorities and sports movement. On match fixing, we found other ways to work together, but the provision you have in the Olympic match fixing code are almost the same as those in the Council of Europe Convention against match fixing. And now on good governance in sport, we are able within IPACS, the International Partnership Against Corruption in Sport, to work together to find solutions. And there are less and less organizations claiming full ownership, and that good governance in sport, it should not be the business of the government, because governments have a role to play also to promote good governance at national level, maybe to condition the granting of subsidies with compliance with some good governance principle. And this is essential to mainstream good governance in sport, because we cannot expect the international federation to be the best example in good governance if all the national federations don't care about this. Governments has also a role to play in prosecuting corruption, including in sport. If corrupt behavior enjoy impunity in all countries, you cannot expect the sports movement to do all the job. And therefore, we need to work together, and that's maybe the future of sport, but it's already the present of sport.
Okay, thanks, Stanislas. Sorry, I didn't mean to pick on you. Later on, we'll open up the discussion to the floor, but I wanted to perhaps start with something that Patrick touched on in his talk, which was esports. And I was interested, Patrick, in how your own federation is addressing and embracing esports, or if it is, do you feel that that FIBA, that esports have a role to play with FIBA?
Sure, it works?
Yes, indeed.
Technology is getting all the... Is it okay when it blinks? No? Now it's green. I use it. No, yes and no. I mean, we have the two main V sports, because at least in that terminology, are the FIFA game and the NBA 2K game. So basketball is already quite present, at least in the top 50, but they're far low compared to League of Legends and things like this. So from that perspective, we're happy. It helps promote the game, but of course it helps mainly to promote the NBA brand in itself. Now, from my perspective as an international federation, what I'm very interested in is trying to find that link between those that game, those that like gaming, but bringing them out and doing the sport then at the end of the day. And that's where we haven't found yet the right way of making that bridge. The 3-on-3 discipline gives us a bridge to that, in the sense that we have created a ranking of players like you would have in tennis. So the more you play, the more you get rankings, and the more you give rankings to a country and so forth. And we have a subset where you can play alone. And by playing alone, you record yourself, you using, and you can also get points. And then you can play the game, and you can also get points. So, but that's still very far from being really involved in esports as the international federation. I think we still have a lot to think about what it really means to become part or having esports under ourselves.
But do you see esports as a way of reaching those millennials that you were talking about?
Yes, definitely.
Yes.
I think they're out there. In some instances, they have training which are crazy. I mean, it's really, they do practice like hell properly, as every other athlete would, for its own discipline out there. There are also, obviously, as in every sport, there are abuses or exaggerations, but we still have to, I think, work through the process and also mentally get ready on how really to embrace it. Right now, it's a purely business-dominated environment. We're probably not yet fit for purpose to really bring them in right like this.
Silke, in your sport, has esports made any inroads? Yes.
Not really, but as an athlete spokesperson, I'm involved in all sports in Germany as well, and I'm as well in discussion with our professional leagues, especially ice hockey, and for them, it's definitely a huge problem. That, for example, maybe you know the German soccer league, Schalke 04, they created an own e-sport team, and this is very professional. They're putting so much money in it, and they are running the business. So it's heavy with promotion, fans, etc., to hold against as the National Hockey League against that upcoming movement in esports.
Loic, have you identified esports as...
We have a couple of handball games, but it's kind of very secret, and
Okay.
nobody's
Now I'm
really
interested.
nobody's really playing it. And you have like a few company. First, they are struggling a bit with image rights. So this was a big discussion because like a few years ago they approached us and they said, yeah, what you guys can do to help us out with a new game. We said, yeah, we can put you in touch with the responsible entities, such as players, for instance. But so image rights was really far from harmonized, and then it's also a matter of quality of the game. It's still rather low. We would embrace it if it was existing. The positive side of it is that it reminds us that in handball, actually, our audience is a bit older than in other sports, like 40 plus. So it reminds us that we should focus more on the millennials. And it's like this e-sport pushing, so like internally, guys, don't forget that you have to develop other ways of playing handball, one being beach handball, for instance. But as to e-sport, it doesn't really exist yet.
Okay, so we started with something very specific. I want to broaden it out now to a much more general question and topic. In 2016, Sir Martin Sorrell, who was then chief executive of WPP, the multinational advertising and marketing group, warned international sports federations that were gathered for the Sport Accord Convention about the consequences of what he called a tsunami of daily non-stop scandals, and Patrick referred to some of them. Sir Martin said, sponsors are questioning their investment and they remain unconvinced that sports legislators and federations are taking matters as seriously as they should. There are few new sponsors, existing sponsors are exiting, and fans are taking notice. The implications are catastrophic, not potentially catastrophic, but catastrophic. And so he asked, so has sport gone bad, or has the world changed and sport failed to keep up? And I should say, his audience was IOC members, it was international federation presidents who perhaps were not used to being asked these questions directly. He said, in any case, you need to get your house in order, addressing them directly. You need to get your house in order and start leading by example. Corporates worldwide have lived in this fishbowl for decades. Now sport has to adapt or die. There is nothing to stop you being replaced. Well, ironically, it is Sir Martin himself who has been replaced since then. As you may know, he had to stand down in his own governance scandal. But leaving aside his own scandal tsunami, since then, was he right? And is there any evidence of sports organisations getting their house in order since then? And perhaps I could start with you, Jean-Loup, on that question.
That's not an easy one, but yes, I think, of course, sports organizations have to react. We heard it before, change or be changed. And what was very important in the previous keynote presentation was that this idea that sport is evolving. It has evolved considerably from the beginning, from the 19th century, 18th century in England, not going back to the ancient games, of course, but to England in the 19th century. And it will continue to evolve. In the 21st century, I'm sure it will continue to evolve. We heard that the international federations were created mostly at the beginning of the 20th century, but this is quite a long time ago. And now, of course, these structures, they have to evolve. And we heard some solutions. There are these subsidiaries, there are the different models, there are mostly associations, but maybe in the future there will be other types of legal structures. I'm proposing myself cooperatives, which are very common in many jurisdictions, in particular in Switzerland. This could be interesting for athletes, for example, to be members of the cooperatives which would run sport in the future. It is not going to happen tomorrow morning, of course, but maybe in the 21st or end of 21st or 22nd century it will happen.
What do you mean by a cooperative?
Well, cooperatives are a form of organization that exists in many jurisdictions and which combine the commercial aspects and the ownership aspect. This is different from a limited company. For example, in Switzerland, MESGO or Coop or Raiffeisen, they are cooperatives, and therefore they are owned by the cooperators. And we could see the analogy here with the athletes. For example, the athletes would own the cooperatives that would own their sport. Going back to e-sport, because many people talk about e-sport, of course we did at the beginning, but we use e-sport in the singular, but in fact we should say e-sports, because there are as many e-sport as there are games, video games. And the big difference with normal sport or traditional sports is that there are owners to these games. For example, FIFA, the FIFA game, FIFA 2018 now, is owned by EA. And so on for FIBA, probably. I mean, I don't know exactly the owner. But so it makes a big difference. This is a new type of player in the sport, or in the esports for the future. But if we go back to the athletes, I think the cooperative would be a solution for the future.
Okay, interesting. Stanislas, do you see evidence of sport beginning to get its house in order, as Sir Martin suggested it should?
Yes, I think so, and for sure it's as a reaction to the scandals that took place in 2014, 15, 16. I think that good governance of sport was already on the agenda for a few years. There was the universal principles of good governance adopted by the IOC, a number of standards, 2008. But indeed, it was moving a little bit slow. And after 2014, 15, it accelerated the movement. And now there is this review of good governance of international federation that was launched by ASOIF. And it's brilliant. We're sitting between Patrick Baumann and Jean-Loup Chappelet. I would not afford criticizing the ASOIF process. But I may formulate what are the expectations from the many governments on this. Is that more transparency is expected on the results collected through this process, because it's very important. I understand the reasoning to not to upset the international federation that engage in this process on a volunteer basis. And those which are the less committed to good governance, we should not name and shame them and send them away. That's a risk. But at the same time, what is at stake is to restore some confidence, some trust. And in keeping all the results confidential, it's not the best way to restore confidence for the public authorities. And the second reservation on this is that it's great for the International Summer Federation, but we would expect more and more federation to take commitment and to engage in that kind of process. And I know, for instance, that the winter sport, they have completed the exercise, but they are not communicating at all about this, not taking public responsibility on their process to improve governance, and that's a pity. And a number of people in the public, in the governments, they say, but what are the other federations doing? And of course, in the future, it would be great to have the GAISF member or a broader cycle of international federations getting involved in this. At the same time, I have to say that the process is moving at a national level, and there are more and more national Olympic committees, national sports confederation, or governments that are launching that kind of a review of the good governance of the national sports movement. And there is a real trend, I think, to improve, to get, Jean-Loup would say, better governance in sport. But there is still a lot of work ahead.
Okay. Patrick, I think I saw you respond when Stanislas mentioned naming and shaming. Was that something that you feel is unfair, or could that be a useful way forward?
No, it's not necessarily unfair. I mean, it's just we're just not ready yet. That's all. I mean, this is a year of work, a year and a half. I mean, it's been so, and I think that we're still missing a bit and piece in terms of matching the issues about transparency, democracy, and decision-making process, and all the criteria that we went through the governance, with coupling them with the financial indicators, how much they have an impact on the way how an international federation structures and taking decision, and that's still not done. And so we're still processing it now. When it's time, I'm sure that everything will be released. But if you go today to you have all out of the 28 international federations, you have a yearly report in, I believe, about 24, where everything is in. So if a public authority wants to read, they can read.
Yeah, Jean-Loup.
Yeah, I think what is important really is not naming and shaming. It is better governance, as mentioned. Everybody talks about good governance, but who are we to say it is good? Is it good today, tomorrow it's bad? What is important is the improvement, and this was shown by the slide of Patrick very well. There has been improvement since 2017 into 2018, and there will continue to be improvements, I'm sure. And regarding the number of federations which are involved, okay, at the moment it started with the Olympic Summer Federation, but the 5 new sports in Tokyo have been added, so it's not only 28 Summer Olympic International Federations now, but it is 33. And I'm so sure that the Winter Federations will, they have been included already, but the results have not been published. But they are willing to do it. And in the future, probably the recognized federations and so on will be involved. But again, what is important is that we show improvements or no improvements, rather than saying this is good, which means nothing, I think.
Okay, thanks. Silke, as an athlete and an athlete's representative, how have you been affected by the tsunami of daily non-stop scandals that Sir Martin referred to? And do you see signs of progress in dealing with them?
Well, I can write a book on it. I'll try to give 5 sentences. I think the most touching scandal, of course, is the Russian situation, which came up in December 2014, and it was touching the German athletes from the beginning on. And with the story, it came out that the Russian athletes were doped by the system. And we're touched because we knew that. We have Eastern German history, and we know what happened to the athletes, and we wanted, and we demanded, and still today.
So you knew then that athletes that you were competing against, Russian athletes you were competing against, were doped?
Yes. It was given in the McLaren report, I think everybody knows. Yeah. But the main point is that the health of the athletes were not protected. And this is what was really touching, which could happen in every other country in the world, probably in Germany, we don't know. But we know these consequences. And we didn't understand really the way of the sport federations, the commitment to the scandal, on the national level, our national federations, the international federations. For the athletes, it was not very transparent which decisions were made and why. We had so many open questions which were not answered until today. For example, after the decision of the executive board of the IOC, shortly before the games in Rio, when they gave the decision back to the IFs, who of the athletes of Russia is able to participate. Each federation did a decision. And until today, we didn't know on what base these decisions were made. And this is really tough for an athlete. Then you go back to the Olympic Games, and you're standing on a starting line. And I think there were many questions in the swimming pool, which were not answered. And we have a discussion between the athletes. It's not necessary that a situation like this comes in the sport. and into the competition during the Olympic Games. And for the athlete, it is important to know consequently before the start is, which decision is to be made and why.
And sorry, just to be absolutely clear, you knew before the McLaren report that Russian athletes that you were competing against were doping?
We always have a problem with doping. I think no one can say there is no doping in sport. We, from our perspective in Germany, we do everything also as athletes to prove that we are not doped. We want to show transparency with doing doping controls, doing ADAMS every day. I think this should be a task of every country. We know that not every country has the framework to establish such a system like Germany does, but the world has to improve this, and we have to support each country that athletes are not doped on the starting line. I don't want to answer the question only on the Russian, because in the end, the Russian athletes are the victims. We know everybody, doping is a part of sport, and we don't want to improve clean sports.
Okay, thanks. Really interesting. Loic, you've just completed your Master in European Sport Governance, supported by UEFA and the European Team Sports Association. What conclusions did you and your colleagues reach about the future of sports governance, and can you see progress being made?
So, but the first part, so we had in Tokyo a session about sport governance, an entire workshop dedicated to the future of sport governance through 5 angles. And MESGO is cross-disciplinary, so it took some time, and we looked to future of leagues, sports organizations, doping through ethics, for instance. And we had to make plans for the next 25 years and try to imagine what would happen. That was in a way interesting, in a way very challenging and almost impossible, like you addressed at the beginning of your presentation. But in a nutshell, few points were actually fascinating. So if you take the issue of doping, for instance, and the matter of gene doping, at the moment it's still a very untouched but fast-growing sector. And how is it going to influence sports? Can we still talk about human performance while you have touched the features of a gene from the very beginning? Will we have, for instance, unisex competitions in 25 years because you have leveled up the natural performance of athletes? We also looked into big data and how it could influence, for instance, the relationship between athletes and clubs or national federations when it comes to bargaining. So if the club says, I'm not going to extend your contract because your data show that you're not performing well anymore, where does that go? And then on a more organizational level, we had large conversations about this pyramidal system. We see that athletes lately, clubs beforehand, they have started to unionize and they want to be empowered. So the athletes, they do not interact with the direct layer of the pyramid they had before, which was clubs. Now they want to interact directly with the top of it. So in 25 years, what does that mean in terms of this pyramid shape system? Are we going to see like athletes on the top with international unions, or is it only a trend and we will lack representativity from these organizations, be it clubs or athletes, but it's going to be addressed? And obviously, are we going to move towards less values and more like sport Darwinism, where some powerful organizations will have managed this curve and we'll have an integrated system with all stakeholders, be it direct or indirect stakeholders, integrated fully in the decision-making process? Or will we have breakaway systems where there is no money going down to grassroots any longer? So these are like the main topics we
Okay,
discussed.
interesting. Yes, and the pyramid system, interesting, Patrick, as an IOC member, in your pyramid you had the IOC at the top, which suggests that it is the IOC's job ultimately to have responsibility for the governance of sport, to be the ultimate authority. And yet, that's not what the IOC was formed for, was it? The IOC was formed to put on Olympic Games. So in what way does the IOC become that ultimate authority, and why should it be respected as that ultimate authority?
Well, I think it's a normal recognition towards the most credible brand within the sports environment. Now, of course, you may question that depending on where you sit. But at the end of the day, even if I'm speaking as president of GAISF, and by the way, we will be expanding the governance work into also the non-Olympic sports, but just simply we cannot afford to have the same type of criteria for the International Federation of Chess as the same as the Football Federation. Those are just simply two different size of federations, of resources available, and at a totally different stage of growth in a life for federations that have been 100 years there, and many of those that are not that old. So, but in any case, it will be moving also in that direction. So we'll expand the ASOIF study in that. But even if you take this, okay, today climbing, surfing are in Tokyo. We don't know whether they will be in Paris, but there are others there that would love to do the same. So all of them aspire to be in the Olympic Games. It's the ultimate dream. It's even more so than being possibly at the World Championship. If I remember what Kobe Bryant told the commissioner of the NBA when he said, oh, we do like football, we go with under 23 to the Olympic Games. He said that shortly before the London Games. And Kobe Bryant said, forget it. I will continue to go to the Olympic Games. That's much more important than my ring. Okay, he had already many, so that's that was an easy way. But the feeling that he expressed on behalf of the athletes was pretty clear. This Olympic has something different. Of course, assuming that level field of play and all the things that we know. So even those that are not yet there, they aspire to go there. So at the end of the day, it is the IOC that is on top of the pyramid, and it is setting trends one way or another. Today, it's changing the Olympic program. It's trying to bring in more youthful discipline. It's discussing cost-cutting measures and things like this to make it sustainable for the next 50 years. And it has, whether it may be back at the time, Pierre de Coubertin did not think of that, but I believe that many of these sports that are not yet recognized were not maybe even really considered sports back at the time. If sport was considered in the English society, or I think that was something that was not serious. So and the real sports, the one that went to the Olympics were the sports. Everything else has come on top over the last 100 years, and it is, I believe, just simply a very natural movement where the IOC is setting a trend for everyone, and at the end of the day, everyone aspires to be in the Olympic Games. So it's not just about organizing games. It is about promoting sports all over the place in the world and the values that go with it. If you look at the recent decision but at the discussion that, for example, is happening now in the Australian Olympic Committee with Thorpe, that went out saying, well, I don't want a result-driven or a medal-driven policy of financing from my National Olympic Committee or whatsoever, because that is just directed to those that can have the resources, but it's leaving everybody else behind. And I prefer that we have more people going to sports than having more medals at the Olympic Games, and I think that's probably also a trend, and if that moves on, I wouldn't mind, because I think that that's a very good trend, and that's the role of the Olympic movement as a global, as a big movement worldwide.
I take all those points, but maybe a question for perhaps Jean-Loup and Stanislas. Critics of the IOC would say that it is, by its nature, conflicted. There are huge conflicts of interest there because its members represent, first of all, individual sports. Secondly, they represent their own countries, or they often feel they do. Would there be a place instead for some kind of world government of sport which was completely independent and which could be seen to be independent? You yourself mentioned conflicts of interest, Patrick. Jean-Loup?
Well, I think it's very difficult to be totally independent from everybody. The academics insist on, being independent, but of course we are paid by universities, so we are not totally independent. And I think it's the same for sport. And I think we should go back there to the ideas of Pierre de Coubertin, that is the IOC members being trustees of the Olympics. Of course, it's difficult for them to extract themselves from their positions, from where they come from. For example, Patrick comes from basketball, but as an IOC member, he is supposed to take decisions without thinking too much about basketball. I know it's very difficult, but it's a theory, and it can work. It's a question of persons, choosing the right persons, the trustees of the Olympics. That's the idea from the beginning. But of course, between the theory and the practice, there might be difficulties. And then I leave it to Stanislas for the World Government of Sport.
Yes, the World Government of Sport, Stanislas. How about that?
Thank you. No, I would say that the position of the IOC as the most representative body of the sport movement is not challenged by the government nowadays. And within WADA, for instance, it's the IOC which is representing the sports movement. And I think on most of the topics, the IOC is a reliable and competent partner. Now, there are some, on the promotion of sport for all, there are a number of organizations which are not affiliated to the Olympic movement, and we also take into consideration some other stakeholders. And maybe a weakness of the IOC would be the representativity of the professional leagues, for instance, the American ones, or the professional sports movement. And sometimes, depending on the topic, we also have consultation with these professional leagues. But in general, there is no prospect of setting up a new world governance of sport with a new umbrella organization. However, there is a recurring proposal to say that on some integrity issue there should be a body, but I think it's mostly the analogy with anti-doping, which is prevailing, because in the field of anti-doping there was a process of harmonization within the governments with the Council of Europe Convention, a process of harmonization within the sports movement with the Olympic anti-doping charter, and at some time they made in the World Anti-Doping Agency. And many people have this process in mind, and when we address other issues such as good governance, match fixing, they say, and when is the agency coming? But it's not, there is no one-size-fits-all solution, and I don't think that we will create agencies for every topic, and there are other ways to create cooperation and to address these issues. But indeed, it is often mentioned in this context to have kind of overarching body to coordinate some integrity issue, but it's not the same as the government of sport.
Okay. Yes, Patrick.
Who's controlling that one? I mean, we can, you know, I think the sports movement comes bottom up, and I think, and that bottom up, as long as it's protected and ensured that it is all the time bottom up and not just from commercially coming down, top down, I think that it is able to self-regulate itself with its mistakes, as in every environment. The second point I would like to make is also that when you are an IOC member, yes, you could be conflicted, but at the end you are in an environment where you have 115 conflicted of different conflicts. So at the end you have to find a common argument. And even when you are in a corporate environment, and you are in a board of a corporate environment, you know that there is a tendency in big companies to take the CEO of that company, to bring it here, to take that. At the end of the day, once you enter in that particular company, you have a legal responsibility to take the decision which are the best for that particular company in which you're sitting. Mm-hmm. And if you fail, you are criminally liable. And to some extent that is not different and might go even further in terms of governance, but certainly that's the same when you sit in a sports body. And you can imagine when you are in a sports body, as I mentioned, you have a board of 15 people from 15 countries from 4 different continents. They all have something back in their mind, but they still have to find the way what is the best for the whole movement.
Okay. There used to be some graffiti on a building in Lausanne, which I used to see every time I came to Lausanne. I think it's been finally washed off, but it was there for a long time. It's near the station. And it said, "Love football, hate FIFA." And I thought that was really interesting. I thought that here was a person, and perhaps that person, you know, perhaps there are many people like that person who, even though they hated what was going on at FIFA, and this was all around the time of the FIFA Gate scandal, it didn't stop them from it didn't prevent them from loving football. So it wouldn't have prevented them from watching the World Cup, for example, even though FIFA is the organizer of the World Cup, which made me wonder whether ultimately these kind of scandals within governing bodies really matter if they don't stop the fans, if it doesn't stop the fans from loving the sport. Loic, what's your view? Why do these scandals matter?
I think one key element is that you have to differentiate depending on which sport is facing the scandal. FIFA can afford many scandals, I believe, before people stop watching it. Some other sports can't. If you take, I don't know, baseball back in the days, for instance, doping scandals probably cost them partly their Olympic spot. We are also discussing about FIBA right now. They're in a tough spot. So it depends on that. And I think sometimes we use a shortcut when referring to sport, which is the sports movement. Like if it's something consolidated and they have all the same issues and can implement the same things together. I don't think so. You have like so many different sizes and cultures in there that if they're not equal in terms of governance, and therefore they're not equal in terms of scandals. And football is probably the only universal sport in this area. And I think handball, for instance, talking about my organization, we do our homeworks as much as possible, but if we start facing one scandal after the other, of course, our sponsors that we had to fight to obtain, they will drop out and go to another one.
Yeah, interesting. Silke, you've spoken very eloquently about how doping affects clean athletes. But what about other kinds of these kind of financial scandals within a governing body? Do they matter to you as an athlete, and do they matter to your fans?
They matter to the athletes, of course. Look, also we are in Germany, and we are a wealthy nation. We're living in some kind of sub-reality, looking on financial and social situation of athletes. Today, we have to say that the situation of a German athlete is completely invalid. It's not a model you can send a youngster in to be very passionate athlete and to, for many years, 1, 2, 3, 4 Olympiads, and to give your lifetime to the sport. You cannot explain it to the parents or to the athlete himself. Then we currently try to establish a further, more civil system that supports the athletes in Germany via our Sport Aid Foundation. We are currently in discussion and negotiation with the parliament. You know, we have no budget currently in Germany. We were very late with the government. But yeah, we have to discuss a new system to offer the athletes for the future a model where our government and the sports system care for the athletes. Currently, we are in the situation, no social insurance, and really struggling with financial things, each athlete. Also, you're a soldier. When you're a soldier, you have a salary, but in Germany, I can promise you, no one wants to go to the weapon for reasons. Coming up these scandals where some's coming up, it's not imaginable for athletes. So we're on the one end of the sport system, we're struggling with what can I eat in the end of the month, really. I had these discussions with our swimming team who were not able to go to buy things directly before the Olympic Games because they didn't have enough money, which is really a problem in Germany. And on the other hand, we have scandals about money, and the sums are really unimaginable. So there is a scissor going very broad, and no one understands from the athlete side what is happening there with the money in the system.
Patrick, you said yourself that there have always been scandals in sport, and there are scandals in society generally. Sport seems pretty resilient, actually. It's lasted this long. So why are we getting so concerned about it now?
I think it's just. I mean, it's the times are what they are. You can today. There is a. I mean, I'm not involved in politics as much as our friends are here. I mean, if you look at the different elections and the debates that are going on in the elections, whether it was back in Austria, back in Hungary, then in Italy, then in Spain, then you have it is a time for trying to shake up the tree in many areas, and it's not just about I hate FIFA. I mean, you could easily say I hate the government, I hate the mayor, I hate the thing, and you will see this as well in many countries. You will see. I mean, it's whatever is an institution and whatever is being there is considered bad. Is the one that is failing to the needs of the citizen, and they don't know. They're working hard and they're paying taxes and they have no clue where the money goes, and at the end they're struggling at the end of the month still. And then they see politicians fighting up there, or rich sports people and sports persons being traded for several hundred millions of dollars, and then having scandals as well. So there certainly is a sentiment that something's wrong. But these inequalities, that's not. I mean, of course, that's a policy matter certainly for governments on how to redistribute wealth, and equally for sports organizations to make sure that whoever participates is treated in an equal and fair way. That certainly is the case when you go to a World Championship or to an Olympic Games, but that's not the case when you're in a professional environment and in a professional league. There, you tend to have those inequality even further and more. So certainly this feeling of hatred towards the organization is not gonna disappear, and it's gonna stay there. But then you will see now in Russia, there will be so many people sitting in front of TV watching the games. Yeah. At the IAAF World Championship, there was the scandal was huge. It was filled even more than before. So at the end of the day, when Martin Sorrell says the fun is affected and he is caring, well, I'm not so sure he's right on that particular one, because at the end of the day, we're all keen at seeing the athletes compete and seeing our favorite team compete, our favorite athlete compete, and at the end of the day, that's what we're interested in, and that's what the television is showing us, and we're going to see. And they're not showing us the inside of the FIFA environment on -3 where they do take the decisions, or the IOC executive board. Nobody cares about that.
Yes. Stanislas, UEFA's just signed an MOU with the Council of Europe, which is aimed at maintaining the European sports model, and which the MOU contends is based on sporting and financial solidarity mechanisms, such as the principle of promotion and relegation, open competitions with a balance between clubs and national teams, and a symbiotic relationship between elite and amateur sport. Well, we saw from Patrick's talk that that's not the only model, is it? I mean, the US model is quite a different one. So why is the Council of Europe, what is it about that model that the Council of Europe wants to support?
Okay. Well, first of all, I have to say that this MOU, it's not a one-shot PR exercise with UEFA. It's reflecting 15 years of close cooperation we had with UEFA on many topics: integrity of sport, promotion of grassroots sport, safety of athletes. And indeed, we had this reference to the European sports model in the MOU, because nowadays it's a matter of concerns in many countries in relation with the EuroLeague basketball. And and we would like in the upcoming years to further work on this and to update the European Sport Charter to reflect these ideas, because we feel that these principles that you mentioned in quoting the MOU are under threat right now. And I think at least in a governmental perspective, the national identity of national teams, the system of promotion and regulation, is something that governments are committed to support. And it was not that obvious in the recent decision of the European Court of Justice, whereby I have to say that sometimes some sports organizations made mistakes, and they could have anticipated some reaction from the European Court of Justice, but it's something we want to put on the agenda.
Okay, thanks. Jean-Loup, ASWAF's self-certification system has come under some criticism actually from the Council of Europe's Parliamentary Assembly, which said that self-evaluation, similarly to any ticking the boxes exercise based on fulfilling questionnaires, is far from being a sufficient basis for achieving long-term goals of good governance in sport. What do you think the ASWAF initiative can achieve, and is there any more effective alternative?
Well, you quoted this Parliamentary Assembly, Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly report, but in fact it says that the ASWAF model was very good. It was a first step. Of course, it was not perfect, and we all agreed on this. And as I said before, we are in an improvement cycle. I mean, this was recognized by the ASWAF itself and somehow by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. So, but of course, they say it should be more independent. And I think ASWAF has taken a decision at its General Assembly in Bangkok recently that the GTF will become the GMU. It's not only a change of name, but it's a more independent body to assess the governance of international federations. And I'm glad to hear that the GAISF members will join, because of course the more members there are, the better it is. This is what we can say. This parliamentary, I may criticize because I'm next to Stanislas and he knows me well. This parliamentary report of the Council of Europe, again, was very contradictory at some point. It says that, for example, the sports organizations should be controlled by a world body. I think they mentioned that, as you did before. And at the same time, the Council of Europe itself, through its sports charter, says that sports should be autonomous. So how do you reconcile this? I leave the question to Stanislas now.
Well, thank you. Well, indeed, it's fair to mention that the Parliamentary Assembly is free to draft and adopt its report, and sometimes the coherence with the already existing standards of the Council of Europe is not their first priority. However, I think that this report reflects the fact that in many countries, the members of parliament, but also sometimes the government, they are a little bit fed up with these scandals, and they expect more transparency, they expect more effort, and that was also what I said earlier while commenting the ASWAF process, which is very good, as I said, but should be further developed and improved. But the Parliamentary Assembly, they are very much on this line to say we should create a worldwide agency, a body, an overviewing body over the international federations. It may be the case in 20 years, but for the time being, it's not realistic, and it's not. The governments are not ready to engage in that kind of discussion. We are very much more pragmatic, and we are very glad that within IPACS we can develop the dialogue with the sports movement, make proposal how to improve the ASWAF process. We would like to have more transparency on this because. Indeed, there is a criticism of self-assessment process, self-evaluation, and we said that we don't have any problem. Governments, the ministers responsible for sports, they said that they don't have problem with the self-assessment process, provided the result can be verified by independent sources. And this is the reason why we would like more detail on the result of the ASWAF process, because then it would be acceptable if we can have academics, independent NGOs, which are doing their own research, and we can compare the result of the ASOF self-assessment with other sources. It would be very satisfactory for many people. As long as it is kept a bit confidential, there will be an expression of distrust on this. But I have some distance, some reservation on the proposals of the Parliamentary Assembly report, but they reflect true concerns from the political world, and they should not be underestimated.
Okay, thanks. I wanted to move on from sort of pure governance issues to perhaps one of the problems that Agenda 2020 and the new norm, the IOC's programs, are trying to address, which is the struggle to find host cities for the Olympic Games. The IOC, as many of you know, and most of you will know, was so concerned that it might lose either Paris or Los Angeles as a future candidate if it awarded the 2024 Games to either one of them, that it changed its own rules to enable it to award 2 games at once to avoid creating a loser. And Thomas Bach, the IOC president, repeatedly called this a win-win situation. But has anything actually been resolved, or has the IOC simply postponed the next crisis? Louis, what's your view on the struggle to find hosts for the Olympic Games?
Well, for the Olympics, I stand quite far away from it on a daily basis. So the examples I can give is from our own events. Yeah. We can't call a Euro event in handball a mega event. So what we do is that we have to listen a lot to the bidders, and whatever conditions we're going to set first, they might come with counter proposals. So of course, like, we have general guidelines, but along the way, we compromise a lot. We also saw this. We also a bit. We're lucky because we're in Europe, so we don't face scandals such as in Qatar, where there is illegal workers or human rights violations. Of course, you could question some democracies in Europe, but overall, these are not things we come across. Then, what we are trying to do is to have different countries bidding together. So they reduce the costs. We make sure that holes are being filled in. I think Eurobasket had also the same trend with different countries bidding for the same event. And in our case, it's been very successful, and we're going to have the next applications being voted upon in a month or even less. And we have 2 big bids coming from 3 countries together. So that's what we want to promote in the future: reduce costs and have more bidders instead of one city.
Okay. Silke, from your point of view as an athlete's representative, how much of a concern is it to you that the IOC is apparently struggling to find host cities?
Look, from our German perspective, we have to ask ourselves as well. We had several bids in the past years, and with 2 of them in Munich and Hamburg, the people were asked if they want the Olympic Games. So first we took the step to ask the base at home, and looking from our perspective, it's always the thing in both Hamburg and München that the people first see their daily problems, and they don't want to have more problems. When you're talking about something like the Olympics or other huge projects, we also have other projects in Germany that are not running, Stuttgart 21, an airport in Berlin. People don't want to discuss among their current situation, and they're very fearful to start new things. New things means infrastructure which needs money or something like that. They want to have a secure framework. And coming from the sport and the Olympic Games, the people say, okay, I know that they have problems. We're not sure if this is the right project that should have a place in Germany currently. what I can tell from an athlete's perspective, as well as a German citizen and European citizen, we had the International Youth Day in Cologne, and an event like the Olympic Games or other huge sport events, multi-sport events, everything is good to be hosted because it brings the world together. People are joining, and all these international and intercultural come together is what our world needs, definitely.
Yes, absolutely. People, the important thing, I think, if you're the IOC, is to make sure that there is not a referendum, because if there is a referendum, people will vote against it. And yet, it seems to be the case that when a country does host the Olympics, mostly they think it was a success. So how do you get, as an IOC member, Patrick, how do you get over that hump where their public opinion is saying, no, we don't want an Olympic Games, and then if they do have one, they find actually it's not such a bad thing after all?
This is, I think, what Silke just said is, I mean, we're all scared of big things, new things, and then we read the titles in the media, and the media don't help in that particular case, I have to say. They highlight mainly what's bad. But behind a Universal Expo or an Olympic Games, there is the opportunity to bring the people together and to create new energies for the country, for the region, for the city that is involved and that is at the center of it. And in some cases, when everybody's complaining that the sports movement is archaic, old, and old-fashioned, at some point you need an electroshock. You need something that brings people together, especially when you only have bad news all the time. And the good thing about sport or about a thing is that it does create, once it's there, it does create mainly and very regularly only good vibes. People are happy. But of course, if you try to rationalize it down and then you try to use it for political purposes, which is what happens all the time when you have a referendum, you start debating it from left in one way and from right in another way and from depending what it is. And of course, that's an easy target for an opposition all the time. That's very unfortunate. I think we're going to go. I don't know. We'll see Sunday what's going to happen here. No, so, but if it's positive, we'll be very happy. At least coming from sport and being a Swiss. Not even if I were not in Liga, I think that we would deserve. We can show the world that we can, and we can do better than others, and that we can use it for growing our sports industry and our tourism industry for the next 30 years. We are investing so much money in many other things, and then we are complaining about, let's say, a portion of that money because it goes to sport or to a mega event. And I think there we lost a little bit the perspective on matters. But talking badly about sport pays. Today it's something that gives you headlines and gives you points in the population, and for your electorate is extremely valuable. If I may, I just want to go back to one point on the governance. I want to highlight what Stanislas said. We have an excellent relationship with the Council of Europe. Now, we may not agree on everything, and I don't think the Council of Europe discloses everything. Sometimes we also don't understand how things get to a certain discussion and to a certain protocol. So, but having said that, I think that the fact that we are working so long together on many things, the similar way UEFA has been working with them, at the end you build up that trust that you need. And sport and governments, it's a binom. It goes together. There's no other way. We may have been fancying for years that we are living in a bubble or outside of it. It doesn't work. And the same for the governments. They say we don't care. But there are things that today, there's no barriers anymore. There's no virtual barriers anymore. The internet goes all over the place. And there's issues that are transfrontalier, how do you say, cross-border. And if we don't work hand in hand, in particular for the integrity of the game, or for any game, then we're stuck. Alone we cannot do. We don't have this great power, public power, that we can send the police somewhere and say, you go to prison. That's not us. So we do need them for that. But we also need them for working in infrastructures, in health issues and so forth. So I think that works pretty well. Where we get where this trust is slightly going in, not yet there, is what we don't understand is that when the European Parliament, which is different, and I appreciate that, is giving in one direction and saying the European sport model is the right way to pursue, with all the ups and downs, please correct, because we are fed up with all the mess that you are creating. But it's the right thing. When the Council of Europe says it's the right thing, and how come that then the body that is supposed to administer that politics takes totally different decisions and sees Europe as the United States of Europe and therefore a copy-paste of the United States? That is where and being in sport, I have absolutely difficulty in understanding this dichotomy between what is the political world saying, which is pretty clear, and we have to get better. If we're not, we should be punished, no doubt. But at the same time, we should protect the European sports model. But then we cannot open the door to by the bureaucracy of the system in Europe. I'm sorry, this is an industry, so it has to respect. So it's free circulation, it's globalization, free market, and it's an industry, and therefore whatever happens. And if a private promoter comes and destroys the FIFA World Cup, we don't care. It's in order. That's where we, as sports movement, fail to understand, and that's where we seem sometimes not to be able to go hand in hand. I'm not saying with the Council of Europe, but in general terms with the authorities.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. Jean-Loup, did you want to make a quick point, and then
I wanted to jump in the bid situation. It's true, there are less bids than there used to be. It's not a new situation that happened in the past, but clearly nowadays there are not enough bids. But it's not only sports or the Olympics which are touched. I mean, all the big projects are having trouble. You mentioned the airport in Berlin. We had a case of airport in France, also in Nantes, which was very difficult and which in the end was stopped. And coming up is Heathrow. I don't know if you heard about Heathrow. Well, I'm sure you heard about Heathrow, the new runway, and the Prime Minister is for, but the Foreign Minister of Britain is against it. It's going to be an interesting debate. But what can we do about the Olympics? I think that the situation is, of course, there will still be some negative votes. But the essential thing is that there are at least two or three candidates, two or three good candidates. And then the Olympics can continue, because the IOC's main responsibility is to award the games every 4 years. So you need candidates. And I think the smart politicians are thinking twice about all this situation, because the problem, I think, if I may say to the IOC, is that there has been a lot of fake news about the Olympics. I mean, you know, fake news, of course, didn't exist 20 years ago, so it was much easier to pass Olympic projects, for example, Olympic bids. But today there are so many fake news, and we've seen that, of course, in Sion and in the Valley, where a referendum will take place this weekend. If you don't fight fake news, they become truth. And I think it's absolutely essential to fight fake news, also in sports and in the Olympics.
Okay, thanks, Jean-Loup. So I wanted to open the discussion out to the audience. Would anyone like to ask any questions to any members of the panel?
Thank you. Stefano Canepera, University of Lausanne. I have a question for Mr. Baumann for your very interesting presentation. You said that sport is moving fast toward Asia, but then you presented the European model and the American model. So my question is, what is, if it exists, a national model of governance of sport?
There is, I would think that the Asian culture is different to what I mean, everyone that has been traveling or comes from there understands that the culture is certainly different in how they deal with sports. And in terms of being part of the international world, it is pretty much similar to the European sports model, less to the American. Now, however, what I said is more that in a very larger context of the economical context, it's that the future is in Asia in terms of economics, not for sport, for everything. And I think that's, just take the Financial Times of today, and you'll see, and you can read it on the front page. But and so that is obviously affecting equally sport. So there is the same struggle that we are finding in Europe is coming also a little bit to Asia, at least to some of those environments, certainly to China in particular, where the ambition to somehow emulate or beat the United States in sports, they are questioning themselves how they should be organized, whether they should be organized more in the way the Americans are, or they should keep being under the, or in a let's say in a quasi system, or that is the European sports model. That's something that you see very clearly. There's movement, and that is coming from the base and from the businessmen, for the people that are investing. So, and they see the U.S. as a competitor in a certain way, also on the field of play, not just in the economy, and therefore they feel that maybe their model could be replicated also in some parts of Asia. The second point that is maybe different to us here in Europe, because we're at least here, is there is much more closer, how to call it, a link between governments and the sports organizations. And that is it's not everywhere the case, but certainly the legislative environment, including also how federations are built, who runs them, and so forth. There, the link with government, you can feel it, is extremely strong. If in Europe there is still, with all the ups and downs of the sports world, and so this view that sport should be autonomous and government should only interfere in critical areas like the integrity areas and when where there is a big mess and so forth, but the rest should be autonomous. In Asia there is a relatively permanent oversight in the different countries from the government on the sports organization. So I wouldn't say it's totally different because they're all members of our international federations, but we would obviously fully understand how presidency, for example, are elected or appointed, or rather appointed rather than elected, and things like this. And that is something that you can't change, and we cannot come, and that is where the exercise of saying what is good governance or not good governance, you cannot come with the view from Europe on what is good in Asia. The same as we cannot go here and saying our model is the one that needs to be adapted to Africa. And that's what makes it sometimes extremely complex in that particular environment.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. More questions? There's well, lots now. One at the back there. Have we got a microphone? I can go to the back. It's on its way. Yes, if you could pass it right back to the back there, please.
My question is not really addressing a person in particular, but more general. But, do you think that the IOC is making enough use of its power when it comes to governance? And I'm thinking about a particular example where some of the 5 new sports that are now in Tokyo 2020 do actually not comply fully with the water code, because some of the qualification events are not in compliance with the water code. And the IOC itself said that it would actually be way too expensive for these federations to make them necessary to be in compliance, but then at the same time, maybe that is the price to pay. So why go faster than the federations can actually follow, maybe in terms of governance? Because we've seen similar things happen with commercialization. It went faster than they could actually control what was happening.
Oh, interesting question. Are you aware of this issue, Patrick?
No, I'm not aware of, because also I'm sitting on the water board. I've not been, we haven't been tabled with a paper saying that one or the other sports would be non-compliant. Therefore, I'm not aware, and I would probably refute, and that's not the case. Or otherwise, it would have been at least on the table of the Water Foundation Board or the Executive Committee to take a decision in terms of compliance.
Can you be specific about which sport or sports?
I think it was surface.
We know who it is. Ah. Well, but there is a, let me, okay, surfing has a, yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, that is a, okay, but that's slightly a different point to, the ISA, which is the International Surfing Association, is WADA compliant, to make it very simple, and the athletes that will be going into the qualification for the will be submitted to whatever is necessary in terms of doping and controls and things, which are absolutely WADA compliant. Now, whether the whole environment of the surfers is WADA compliant, that's a totally different question. The surfing is one of those that I mean, of course, you cannot go into details when you go through what's happening in the world of sport, but surfing is, in fact, the federation that is relatively young, and generally it is made up of professional organization of surfers. So promoters call it, or organizers, and there are a few. Some are the most important one. They have the key surfers worldwide with the credibility for it, but they are not, they are now trying to bring everyone under the International Surfing Association. And the condition for getting to the Olympics will be that they have to be under the ISA. But all those organizers of surfing events and all those where the major surfers or key surfers are participating in events, these are organizations that are not directly under the control of the ISA. And as a consequence, they may or may not be WADA compliant. I cannot say, but this is, it's to some extent not much different to, we have a big issue with the 3 professional leagues in the United States. I mean, the NBA, the NHL, and then the others who are not WADA signatories, but also because the doping matter is a matter of collective bargaining with the athletes. So it's not something that you can regulate through a law in the United States, but it's a bargaining between employer and employee, and therefore, as such, they are not directly, you could say, WADA compliant, but what the more correct term is, they are not signatory of the WADA code. But when the NHL players or the NBA players, or back in a time the baseball players or whatever, when they were moving into a USA team and getting into the Olympics, they were fully WADA compliant and tested and over-tested and tested back for in every way possible, just to make sure that they're nothing. At least the ones that. At least the ones that I know. So, but that's not. Now, your general question, how strong the IOC can be, I think that leads back to the issue about the governance and even this work that is being done by the GTF. At the end of the day, even if today our friends in the government may say it's not public yet, but what really is behind the columns and the bars in the governance report, I think that over time, the IOC will make it mandatory that certain minimum compliance have to happen in good governance in topic 1, 2, 3, 4, 10, or whatever they are. And if not, your funding will be cut as much as a government will cut the funding of a national governing body. And if you continue, you will just simply be kicked out of the Olympics. Now, when this will happen, that's, I can't tell you. But certainly, I think that's the trend, and that's where it's going. So at the end of the day, the IOC has the opportunity to say no or yes when the time is right. And to our understanding right now, the ISA is WADA compliant.
Okay, time's getting a bit short, but I'd like to take 1 or 2 more questions. This gentleman here.
I'm sorry, I have also a question for Mr. Patrick Baumann. In terms of sustainability and social responsibility, in 5, 10, 20 years in the future, what do you see, what do you foresee in international sports federations? Do you think there will be some or big changes in their governance and management practice? For example, new budget with a new CSL department or sustainability department or commission, or hiring more employees for sustainability and social responsibility. Actually, in 2013, International Ice Hockey Federation created a new social and environmental committee, and they're doing very actively now. So it will be honor for me to hear your opinion in international sports federations, in terms of sustainability and social responsibility. Thank you.
To be short, I think yes. It will be more and more present in the activities of international federation, as much as it is already very much active and present in the International Olympic Committee. Probably the CSR even more so than the sustainability. Sustainability for each individual international federation is not always that simple to set it up in a proper way, and it might be easier for the IOC to coordinate that more efficiently. But I understand that from the inquiry that the IOC has done on every international federation, everyone is already active also on the environmental aspects and sustainability of that. CSR even more so, because at the end of the day, it is still about the real value of sport, which is to bring sport to everyone, whether he can or not afford it. And there's a lot of parts of the world that cannot afford it, and it is our duty, responsibility, our way of giving back to everyone the opportunity to practice sports, whichever sport it is. So we have created a specific foundation for that. Others have a commission for that, and I believe that's going on. And what is very good is that many of the athletes that have been successful themselves are actually extremely active, either in matters of sustainability that they care particularly, but certainly also in matters of corporate social responsibility, and they're giving back a lot to less developed and more difficult regions to reach with the whole structure of an international federation.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. More questions? There's one there, the lady in green. It's on its way to you.
Thank you for the presentation. My question also is to Mr. Baumann. As part of the bidding evaluation commission for 2024 and 2028, and now part of the evaluation commission of 2028, do you see similarities between the implementation of the bidding rules in the two candidatures? And do you see how the 2024 bid could bring something to the 2028 Olympic Games?
At least it allows me to make a little point just as a, I don't think the IOC was afraid of losing one or the other. I think the IOC was very much intent on trying to get both. And I think the primary focus was that. It was not a matter of fear, but it was a matter, how can I have, I'm having a golden opportunity here. So how can I be fast and reactive in a 100-year-old organization and change the rules in a way that I can have the best of the possible scenarios, and having two great cities for 24 and 28. Now, I think the changes of the bidding process now is made in a way that it is, and I think this has happened also in our international federations in the past. We've been fortunate enough that you send out the book with 15 pages of conditions, and you get back 10 candidates, 15 candidates, 20 candidates, and you just put pick. It was relatively simple for international federations. For the IOC, it's been always a little more complex. It's much bigger. So, but that obviously is no longer the case, that you have that kind of easygoing and coming bid process and many candidates coming. So you do need to work with the cities. The good thing about the Olympic Games is that it can help, and I think the Ministers of Sport, for example, were, at least in Europe, they were in Paris just 10 days ago, and were discussing about what is mega events and how in fact Europe should embrace mega events, should help and should make it happen more often than less, rather than less. In fact, also trying to get a bit against the democratic trend of trying to vote them down all the time. But this process is now a partnership between the city and the owner of the event. Cities have plans, 30, 40, 50 years plans of developments, whether it's for an area, we've seen London, whether it's for the whole city, we've seen Barcelona was one of the greatest examples. And if those plans match with what is required for an Olympic Games, it's the perfect match. you're not spending more just because you have the Olympic Games. You're just accelerating your investment plans in your city and in your region by using as a catalyst the Olympic Games. And the process today is leading to 1 to 2 years of discussion before even you get into the candidature system. And the experts of the IOC are traveling to the cities, whoever wants. You don't even pay for it anymore. You go, they tell you, no, this is not very logical, change it. This is not in order, cut it down. Why didn't you think about that? And so forth. And I think this process will lead to many more candidatures, and we've seen already some signals in that area than the IOC was even thinking of. But there's still work to do. It's not all about just simply addressing the candidature process and making sure that values, missions, and are exactly in sync between the event itself and what the city wants. But it's then also probably some work on the program itself, on the size of the games and so forth, that the IOC also is now working in terms of trying to get less cost and other aspects as well.
Okay, I think we've got time for one last question. Ideally one that all the panel can answer. Gentleman in blue at the back there. Oh, okay. I'm told we have time for 2 or 3 more questions. So good news.
Thank you very much. I have a question for all of you, specifically to Jean-Loup, Stanislas, and Patrick Baumann. You said, so Patrick Baumann, you said at the beginning, sport reflects, mirrors society. So what happens in society happens in sport to some extent. The governance topic started after Salt Lake City scandal. You said it at the beginning, gender balance, term limits. Then in 2008, the IOC produced the Principles Universal, the BUPS. And then there have been a couple of frameworks on sports governance. There is a major issue today with sexual harassment, and you showed a picture of Harvey Weinstein today, before. And I was wondering to what extent this issue could be integrated in the governance narratives, because now the things are more or less consolidated with the works of ASOIF, the Council of Europe, and other stakeholders in the field of sport. But you have these trends, this stress on the system, so new issues. Would this be something that would be dealt within the framework of governance, or is something completely else?
Actually, I'm going to ask Silke to answer that one first, as a representative of athletes. And interestingly, as you're probably aware, Silke, there's a lot of pressure on the USOC over the sexual harassment scandal there, and on the USOC to take ultimate responsibility for it. As somebody who represents our National Olympic Committee, what's your view about that?
First of all, the topic sexual harassment is, as well as doping is, an appearance in sports. We also have cases not comparable with the one in the US, but it's really touching what's happening there, and we feel that, to be honest, the sport system is not able to handle these cases. What is it, like doping? When a coach is touching an athlete, a youngster, it's a situation of dependencies. The athlete is under pressure. Shall I say something or not? What's happening? What are the consequences? So it's not in the interest, and we feel it in every case, of the federation to clarify the situation with, for example, a coach or the one who did. It's more or less the situation that the athlete stands alone, has no legal consultant, and we have to ensure that all athletes are protected in that field. So what is our topic in Germany as athletes representatives? Maybe some of you know that we founded a new organization that actually should provide service to the athletes and overtakes the work operationally of the Athletes Commission. Athletes Commission stays as it is. The structure will not be changed, but we need a body that is working for us, because I'm a volunteer a full-time volunteer. And I need somebody who's working for me, definitely. And our new organization can be a standout as a point for athletes to go to speak to in case of sexual harassment. Why this? We need an independent institution for the athletes that is outside of the federation and the sport system, when they can go to and consult what to do in these cases, so that you are not talking as an athlete in between these dependencies. You're normally integrated.
Perhaps I could just ask you also, just to expand on that, with I know you're just back from Canada, where you were part of a group that is developing an athlete's charter. Can you just explain a little bit about that as well, and how that might have a role to play in this area?
Yes, of course. I think, as I mentioned already, the Russian scandal brought out many questions, and of course, looking on the Russian athletes, as I said, we were touched because the athletes' rights and the health of the athletes were not protected. And this is what we started with the WADA Athletes Committee. We wanted to point out what are the rights of the athletes, not only what is demanded by the athlete. He has to do the doping control, he has to do ADAMS, he has to do everything. His personal rights are touched very, very deeply and is not confirmed with our constitution in Germany or in Europe. So what are the rights of the athletes? And this is not written down in the WADA code, for example. And this is what we want to bring together, of course. Actually, in our opinion, the WADA code needs a philosophy that is binding, and in case of binding, looking on the rights of the athletes. And in case of the rights are not protected or something is happening, also a sanction system needs to be implemented. So on the one hand, if an athlete is progressive in doping, he will be taken out of the competition and training. And on the other side, if someone is touching the athlete's rights, it can be everything. Data protection, everything, also sexual harassment. He should also be sanctioned, of course. It's a depending system. The athlete has an entourage, and we have to observe everything, in our opinion.
Okay, thanks, Silke. Did anyone else want to address the sexual harassment question? Yeah, sure.
Well, I would like to say that we have taken an initiative called Start to Talk, and if you go on starttotalk.org, you will see some presentation and tools that were developed, and we are trying to commit our member states and partner sports organizations to address this issue and to start campaigns, to train coaches, to develop awareness raising tools for the parents and the organization. Now, to answer Michael's question, whether it should be part of a good governance framework, I'm a little bit reluctant, because there is a trend sometimes when we open the discussion on good governance to put everything you would expect from sports organization in good governance. And in the presentation that Emmanuel made at the beginning of the conference, he gave a definition of good governance, which is about process, and for me it's about democratic functioning, transparency, accountability, these principles of good governance. And if you try to include detailed regulation on anti-doping, fight against sexual harassment, racism and everything in good governance, you will end up with very heavy books that will knock out every sports organization. And those are issues to be addressed, and they are very essential, but we should not put everything under the title of good governance, because we are mixing up things that are a little bit different. That's my opinion.
Jean-Loup.
I fully agree, and but I still think that there should be an indicator about whistleblowing mechanism, not only for abuse, sexual harassments and so on, but other abuses, doping, ethical matters, corruption, and so on. So this is essential that some whistleblowing mechanism is put in place. maybe independent or not independent, but organized, and this is part of better governance. And we have a PhD candidate working on this at IDHEAP at the moment.
Right. Okay, another question, and this one probably, I guess, will be the last one at the back there.
Hello, thank you for the presentation as well. My question goes to Mrs. Silke Kassner. You touched a little bit the financial topic, the struggles that the athletes have to take to go to the Olympic journey. Do you think that the revenue distribution for the Olympic Games should change in order to be more transparent, should go directly to the athletes, and or Rule of 40 should be eliminated in the Olympic Charter?
I, of course, like your question.
Maybe, Silke, you could just explain.
I can explain
little
the
bit of
entire
background.
context. I should do, because in Germany we have a proceeding with our cartel office, which came from the sport gooding industry, who were asking if the rule number 40 is a monopoly situation for all the companies who want to marketize athletes and themselves during the competition period of the games. When we got the information that the proceeding was running, we had shortly founded our organization in Germany. It was just 1 week old. We found out that we could be part of this proceeding, antitrust proceeding, and this is what we do as well today. We are a party of that, as well as the IOC and our NOC is, and we could give input and feedback on rule number 40 of the IOC Charter. This is just the context. We did this on 23rd of May, and we wrote down that the athletes worldwide participating in the games should get a revenue as a compensation of the Olympic marketing revenues as well. And we had a huge discussion in Germany about what should it be, and what kind of compensation should it be for an athlete who is preparing several years for the Olympic Games, which is a lifetime invest. And we all know for sure that not every athlete earns money with his sport. In Germany, I can tell you, just a few people do earn money. It's skiing or something. Okay, we made a number. It's about 25% from the IOC revenues, marketing revenues, to give it back to the athletes. We have an idea, of course, how it should make sense. We're thinking about the education of the athletes, or the job transition situation, which is very heavy to handle for the athletes. And this entire subject belongs to the social and financial security of an athlete during his sporting career. So this is maybe a concept we can talk about in future, that athletes should be safe, that the international sport system and sport organizations can better take care of the athletes in that way. If they also spend more revenues to the athletes, or spend it to the education of the athletes. We also made a second point, which is, we said, the anti-doping budget needs more power, so that the anti-doping organization should become more independent if they have more money. And as I've said in the beginning, we all know that many countries in the world are not able to establish a very good running and effective anti-doping system. But if we push money from marketing revenues to the anti-doping more, we could improve the system, I'm sure, with that.
Patrick, did you want to respond to that challenge to the IOC's Rule 40?
I leave
that to the courts in Germany to respond to that. I'm not, there are proceedings, so it's not my, certainly I'm not, I think it's, there is, I'll make a slightly different comment. Challenges on antitrust of the system of sport are extremely dangerous for the whole sport. And when you start to get into antitrust issues on sport, then we go back to the conversation whether yes or no the European sports model should exist or not. And I think that those who challenge it, they don't understand what they're really challenging, because just to challenge a point, you can have the whole castle go down. Then there's no Olympic Games anymore, there's no World Championship, it's going to be privately organized, and good luck to that. Now, that might not be just the case for that, but it's just simply a fact that if we put the issue on sport and things on the terms of antitrust, sport is going to lose, and we have a history of that in losing, and the United States has started first, so it's not a matter of Europe. There's only one organization that has obtained in the United States an exclusivity of being nominated as a monopoly, and everybody else none. So there's a track record there. I think that's one point. The second, I think about the revenue redistribution. I mean, I believe that there is a revenue distribution scheme which triggers down the pillars of the International Olympic Committee, whether these are international federations, who then in turn can trigger down to the national federations where the athletes come from, and the National Olympic Committees, who are the ones that are inviting the athletes to the Olympic Games. Now, is there enough money that is going to one or the other pillar or not? That's a long debate, even between just simply the two pillars. And then what the money is being used for within the National Olympic Committee or within the International Federation, that's another question and another topic. And I believe that there is certainly room there for improving the situation of the athletes if it needs improvement. There is 10,500 athletes. There's many more out there that are training, and there needs to be some sort of parachute system, and it has to somehow bring programs that will affect everybody and not just the 10,500. But having said that, this is a request from the athletes in Germany, and I'm sure that they will have the opportunity to express their point of view.
First of all, it is not only a request from the athletes in Germany, which was also very interesting for me to know. We opened a letter to Thomas Bach so that he's not informed by the proceeding. We wanted to be progressive and sent him a letter and explained our position about that. And we directly got international feedback by athletes, which was very positive, and they agreed totally on that issue we gave in that special German case. As you mentioned, I'm currently coming back from Canada, where I was also on the podium with the World Anti-Doping Agency, talking also to Kirsty Coventry, the IOC chair, Paula Radcliffe from the IAAF Commission, Athletes Commission, etc. Very good people and also very constructive in the debate. Athletes from all over the world joined there, and they made the same point on that. I think as a sport governing body today, in the 21st century, we can take more care of the athletes. Athletes are doing their sport in very, very different frameworks, and it's not easy for them, independent where they're coming from, completely independent, and they need to be, take more care of them. They're giving really full power and lifetime on the sport, and in the end, they themselves have less revenue. I completely agree. There are good things happening in the IOC with scholarship system, etc. But why shouldn't we think about to enlarge a scholarship also for youngsters? We're talking about Youth Olympics, whatever, but we really think about a duty of care for the athletes, and this is why we're also talking about that.
I think this is a debate that might carry on after this session. But now, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to thank the panelists. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much to you, Callum. This was a very interesting debate. And now I'll invite you for drinks and standing dinner. Thank you.